the rain after the heat. It was already pouring by the time we left the theater. The sky had that dark, heavy look, a hazy mix of greens and browns that hinted at days of oppressive heat, finally giving way to rain. It was the kind of rain that you wanted, almost needed, but of course neither Joe nor I had thought to bring an umbrella. We weren't the type to carry around anything just in case. That's how we found ourselves huddling under the old theater marquee, trying to keep our bags dry while Joe talked animatedly about the movie we'd just seen. It had been an indie flick, a strange dystopian take on a world that seemed stuck in a cycle, like time itself had rewound. Joe was especially fascinated, her expressive hands framing ideas as she spoke. It's like this slap in the face to everyone who thinks the past was better. You know? She said, popping a piece of popcorn from the bag she'd saved. People forget the privilege that comes with nostalgia. They don't see that they're only able to miss something because they don't have to live through it. I watched as the street lamp cast delicate shadows on Joe's face. In the dim light, her eyelashes flickered like branches. Her face was full of passion as she unpacked her thoughts, moving at a pace that demanded my attention. These were the moments when Joe was most alive, brimming with ideas and inviting me into her world, one that I was only beginning to understand. It's genius, really, she continued, her voice alive with excitement. How the movie shows the illusion of the past, the way it binds us. We live it every day, you know? It's all right there. Her eyes glinted, and she reached out to pinch my hand, a familiar habit of hers whenever she got nervous. This time she did it with a smirk, like she was daring me to disagree. I laughed softly, loving this part of her. The way she could take the smallest details and turn them into theories on life and society. She would call me into her world like that, making sure I saw things from her unique perspective, finding joy in the role she played in my life. Joe was my portal to something more than the everyday, and she knew it. So, I ventured, letting my eyes drift down the wet street. You think there's no real difference between now and the past? Not on the surface, maybe, she replied, twirling a strand of her dark hair as she thought. But the patterns, the underlying ideas, they don't really change. People still fight the same battles, just with different tools and words. The past isn't really the past if it's still happening now, right? I nodded, though part of me wanted to argue. But things have changed, Joe. Like, in the 20s we wouldn't even be able to be here together like this. She shrugged, her mouth curving into a thoughtful smile. Okay, sure. But there's still that unspoken feeling. You see it too, how people look at us even now, trying so hard to act normal around us. You can feel it, can't you? It's like... She paused, letting the rain spatter on her hand as if to cool the intensity of her words. It's like everything is still held together by threads of the past, pretending it's different when it's really not. Joe's words hovered in the air, weighty and alive. I watched as she leaned slightly forward, her face glowing, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't really think this world is as free as it claims, do you? She asked, her gaze searching mine. I could feel her impatience, the passion that ignited in her whenever her ideas met any resistance. Maybe, I faltered, trying to find my own footing. Maybe we just need to look for the good changes, the things that let us be happy now, in spite of it all. I reached up, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face, tucking it gently behind her ear. Her skin was warm beneath my fingers, the rain having cooled only her cheeks, and for a second we were both quiet. Joe held my gaze, her dark eyes thoughtful, before she took my hand, pulling me gently out from under the shelter. The rain was slowing now, becoming a light mist, and the city lights glistened in the puddles around us. We walked in silence, our steps matching, the earlier frustration fading as the coolness of the night wrapped around us. It was one of those quiet, intimate silences that only Joe could create, where nothing had to be said. As we walked, I felt that familiar thrill of being with her. The sense of awe that someone could feel things so deeply and speak so freely about them. Joe was her own world, a place I had been invited into, and even if I couldn't always understand it, I knew I wanted to stay. In the soft glow of the streetlights, our shadows mingled as we headed home. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time we reached Joe's building. She lived in an old, charming brownstone with winding staircases and creaky floors that somehow matched her personality. The entryway light flickered as we stepped inside, casting an amber glow on the worn-out carpet. Joe led the way up the narrow staircase, her hand still loosely holding mine. By now we had fallen into a familiar rhythm. I'd been spending more time here than at my own place lately, and I knew where she kept the spare key, which mugs were her favorites, and the way she liked her coffee, a single spoonful of sugar and no cream. Small details that I'd never even thought to remember for someone else somehow mattered with Joe. Inside her apartment, everything was arranged in a mix of intentional design and casual chaos. Shelves were lined with books, dog-eared, stacked sideways and upside down. The kitchen table held a scatter of papers from a project she was working on, and the walls were adorned with a mix of her own paintings and posters from different art festivals. In one corner, a vase held a single dried daisy, petals still intact and somehow beautiful in its withered state. Joe tossed her bag onto the couch and gestured for me to sit. She disappeared into the kitchen, re-emerging with 2 glasses of iced tea she'd made earlier that afternoon. She handed me one, then sank into the cushions beside me, curling her legs beneath her. "You know, I really meant what I said earlier," she murmured, staring down at her drink. "Sometimes I get so overwhelmed thinking about it. How much hasn't changed, even when it seems like we've come so far. Do you ever feel like that?" I thought about it for a moment. I think maybe I try not to. It's easier to believe that things are getting better, that we have more choices now, more freedom, that somehow that matters. Joe nodded, swirling her glass. "But that's just it. Sometimes I wonder if it's really freedom or just a different kind of, I don't know, permission, I guess. Like it's acceptable now, but it's not really embraced. It's like people tolerate us, but they don't really understand." Her words settled in the air, weighty but honest. I admired that about Joe, how she could voice what others were only beginning to understand themselves. There was something freeing about being around her, like she pulled back the curtain on reality just a little bit, showing me truths I hadn't known were there. "So what would that real freedom look like to you?" I asked, genuinely curious. I turned to look at her, and she was already watching me, a small smile on her lips. "For one thing," she said, her gaze softening, "I think we'd get to just be. Not have to justify who we are or explain why we don't fit into neat categories. Just live." I nodded, letting her words sink in. In Joe's presence, I often found myself contemplating things I usually skimmed over. Maybe that was why I felt so drawn to her. She was a doorway into a world that was both familiar and entirely new. After a while, Joe's expression shifted, her usual spark of humor returning. "And besides," she said, smirking as she set her glass on the table, "we should probably spend a little less time overthinking and a little more time actually living. I mean, what good is all this introspection if we don't make some memories to go with it?" I laughed, appreciating her ability to switch from deep thoughts to lightheartedness so easily. "All right then," I said, feigning seriousness. "What do you suggest?" She pretended to think for a moment, her eyes darting playfully. "I think I should teach you the proper way to beat me at chess. You know, to keep up with my brilliance." I rolled my eyes. "Last time I beat you 3 times in a row." "Beginner's luck," she shot back with a grin. grabbing the chessboard from her shelf and setting it on the coffee table between us. We played for a while, our laughter filling the cozy space as pieces clattered on the board. Jo leaned forward, watching my every move, her competitive streak in full force. She muttered strategies under her breath, acting like a coach with some grand plan, even as her pawns fell one by one. I couldn't help but feel grateful to be there, wrapped up in the warmth of the moment and the ease of her presence. When I finally claimed victory, Jo groaned dramatically, falling back against the cushions. "You know what?" she said, tossing a pillow at me. "Maybe I did let you win." "Oh, sure," I replied, catching the pillow and tossing it back. "Is that what you tell yourself every time I win?" Jo laughed, the sound filling the room. She reached over, her hand finding mine again, giving it a squeeze. "Thanks for coming out with me tonight," she said softly. "For listening to me. I know I can get a little intense sometimes." I shook my head. I wouldn't have it any other way. We sat like that, her hand in mine, neither of us needing to say anything more. The world outside seemed to quiet down, and all that was left was the warmth of Jo's touch, the soft hum of the city beyond the window, and the feeling that, for tonight at least, we'd carved out a small space for ourselves, one that felt like a taste of that freedom she'd been talking about.